Hello and welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast. I am your host, Paul Rader. Last week, we dove into the debate over home rule, which refers to a local government's capacity to administer its affairs apart from state government involvement. That included things like how the U.S. Constitution makes no mention of local governments, yet there is some interaction between federal and local government, the development of home rule historically, the antithesis to home rule, which is called Dillon's rule, and some of the arguments made for and against home rule and Dillon's rule. As a reminder, Dillon's rule basically states that local governments can only do what a state government specifically allows for the local level to do and what is absolutely necessary for the local government to function. But today, we're going to look at more recent developments in home rule, whether for or against. Also, what are some of the biggest challenges to the expansion of home rule? What are some of the potential opportunities for the expansion of home rule? And ultimately, why should you care so much about home rule? Now, I'm not saying whether home rule or Dillon's rule is the quote unquote best option for governance. As always, I keep my opinion out as much as I possibly can, but it is of great importance to think about and to discuss. So let's get to it. First of all, recent developments regarding home rule. So we've seen over past couple decades increasing levels of state preemption, where basically the state government passes a law before local governments can address a specific issue. Ultimately, state law is supreme over local law. Even in more home rule oriented states, they largely have to adhere to state law. And there have been some prominent examples of state governments preempting the local level, which we'll get to in just a moment. But various state legislative bills are being passed and or discussed that include what we call preemption clauses. They outright state this law preempts local regulations or something to that effect. So some of the examples that we see include look at the early months of the COVID pandemic. States took to preempting many local laws, whether it was calling for shutdowns of businesses and schools and all that, or whether it was to prevent shutdowns. A lot of states took the initiative to, instead of let local places decide or local governments decide whether to keep things open or not, state governments came in and said, everybody's going to stay open or everybody's going to shut down. Lately, immigration is probably the biggest flashpoint across states. States aligned with the Trump administration have taken to implementing his policies at the state level, pressuring local governments to conform. And Florida is a big example of that. We've seen some universities and county police departments sign deals with ICE to enforce immigration policy from the Trump administration. And Florida, speaking of, in recent years, they've had other issues that they have preempted local government on, including back in, I want to say it's 2018, there were a couple of local governments that were looking to ban plastic straws. And so the state government actually stepped in and banned bans on plastic straws, said you can't ban plastic straws. So that's another example. And local government officials that try to defy state government preemption can potentially be removed by the state on various grounds. So even if you really strongly disagree with the state government's policy, local government officials can only do so much. And how exactly they can be removed differs from state to state. But some of the grounds that state government officials can claim to remove these local officials on is malfeasance, which is an act that is illegal and causes physical or monetary injury. So if they don't follow state law, they defy state law, basically that act is illegal. And then they could say, well, this also led to a physical or monetary injury. Misfeasance, which is an improper performance of a lawful act. So what you did was legal, but you didn't do it the way that you were supposed to. And then nonfeasance, which is the failure to act when action is required. So if you talk about immigration, for example, if a local government tries to not implement state government policy on immigration, that's probably one of the most common grounds you'll see state government officials try to remove local government officials, by saying they're guilty of nonfeasance. They did not act when action was required on immigration. Uh, Other developments related to home rule, though not necessarily specifically whether for or against home rule, but we talk about special legislation by states, which, again, that is legislation in state governments, or legislation that state governments pass that target a specific local government. So if New York wanted to pass a law specifically for New York City, or Florida was specifically passing a law for Miami, that's considered special legislation because it only affects a specific piece of the state, not the whole state. There's not an easy way to tell how much special legislation has been passed, but we do know that there's still a lot of those in states that align more with Dillon's rule. And you might still see it in states that have a little bit more home rule as well. And it's part of why some state constitutions and statutes are getting larger and larger. Some people might say that they're bloated. An example is in Alabama, which heavily restricts home rule. They have by far the longest state constitution. It's like 150,000 words, past second place, and I can't remember what the second longest constitution is. It's like Pennsylvania or something. And that's partly because of special legislation getting added to the Constitution and for the state statutes. One particularly interesting development in regards to home rule is there was a home rule amendment proposal by the National League of Cities. So the National League of Cities is the most prominent advocacy body for municipalities. And as it's a local government advocate, it is obviously pro-home rule. In 2020, or right around then, the NLC for short, they published a report called Principles of Home Rule for the 21st Century. So the short description of it is that it gives an overview of the history of home rule, legal background in regards to it, arguments in favor of increasing home rule. But the culminating piece of the report is a model state constitutional article that the NLC says is a starting point for reform. So they're not saying that each of these states should add this exact article to every state constitution word for word. It's more of a basis. And the NLC also gives some commentary on every section of the proposed constitutional article to, as they put it, illuminate where the provisions draw on existing examples of home rule in practice and where the proposed language innovates. I'll include the link to it in the show notes if you are interested in looking further into it. But let's get into some of the challenges that are facing home rule. And this is not necessarily a comprehensive list, and each state might have its own unique circumstances. But I just want to give a general overview of the hill that home rule, if you want to expand home rule, the climb that it has to make, because home rule does face a lot of headwinds, even though there's been some times in history where home rule has gotten a little bit of steam. It's sometimes also been beaten back. But I'm going to give 8 different challenges, 8 of the biggest challenges that we see for home rule. So, first of all, we see less media coverage of and less importance placed on local government. So because there's less coverage of local governments, there's less chance for home rule, which is a fundamentally local issue, even though it has some state and national implications, to get attention from regular people. Most people don't really pay attention to local government politics. And why is there less coverage of local government politics? Fewer people care about local governments and vote on their issues and pay attention to them and think about local politics matters. There's also this erroneous belief that federal and or state governments handle more issues than they actually do. I remember seeing I won't say the name, but a celebrity back when Barack Obama was in office had some sort of issue with her one of her kids in school and was calling on Barack Obama to do something about it. It's like, well, he can't really step in there. That's not for him to step into. That's a local government issue. Not to rag on that particular person, but it's not that uncommon for people to think that federal or state government steps into more circumstances than they actually do. So fewer people care about these local governments, partly because there's so many of them to pay attention to. There's tens of thousands of local governments to account for. Some of them are pretty small, and then some of them are huge. The really big ones will get more coverage, like New York City or Los Angeles or Miami or Chicago. And then these individual local governments affect fewer people. Each individual one affects fewer people than a state or federal government does. So that's also partly why local government is treated as less important. And then also, it's often really hard to find information about local governments, even for somebody like me who does this kind of thing for a living. Lots of other people who do this research for a living. And if it's hard for us to find information about these local governments, imagine just regular people who are not doing this for a living, who have other jobs to take care of and kids and spouses, all these other things that take their attention. So then they also have to try to find information about these local governments, and they don't even know where to find them. Partially because we don't teach people very well where to find this information. And it's partially the fault of these local governments, partially not. Some of these local governments could make it easier for people to find information about them, but some of them are just also not very well funded in that capacity. And I can tell you from looking at some of their websites looking for information, they look like they came straight out of early 2000s GeoCities. Some of you might be a little too young to remember that, but it was an old format for websites early on in the days of the internet. And so this becomes a vicious cycle where these local governments don't get covered, so info is less available. People care less because they can't find that information, and they don't know that they should care about that information. Rinse and repeat just keeps going and going, and so people don't really pay attention to local government unless some sort of state or national implication is involved, or if it's a really big municipality. So that's one issue that home rule faces, that lack of coverage on local governments and people thinking local government is just not that important. Number two is previous court rulings on home rule. Last episode, we highlighted how Dillon's rule had courts backing it, namely John Forrest Dillon himself, who was the state Supreme or the Chief Justice of the Iowa Supreme Court. Even though that was specifically for Iowa, many other states took a similar view because he wasn't the one who came up with the concept. He's just the one that really popularized it. And so the name Dillon's rule, the legal philosophy was attributed to him. But he was just saying something that was conventional wisdom at the time, where basically local governments were just creatures of the state. But other states took that similar view. But we also saw the Cooley rule from Thomas McIntyre Cooley, who was a Michigan chief, or the Michigan Supreme Court Chief Justice, who said that local governments have some inherent rights to self-governance. And so there was a little bit of steam that home rule started to pick up in the late 1800s and early 1900s, but then it kind of got scaled back. So a lot of times courts have ruled in favor of Dillon's rule as opposed to home rule. Now, it's not impossible to overturn precedent set by previous court rulings, but it doesn't happen all that often. SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States, has noticeably done that in the past with things like civil rights. We went from Dred Scott versus Sanford, where Black people were treated as property and had no inherent rights. Then you got to Plessy versus Ferguson, which was somewhat better, but still had that erroneous separate but equal philosophy, where as long as you provide the same kinds of facilities to Black people, you could keep them separate from white people, which, I mean, inherently does not make it equal. And then to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which basically said separate but equal was a bunch of crap and led to integration of schools and society in general. But we also saw abortion a few years ago, where Roe v. Wade was mostly overturned. So some states have taken to putting more restrictions on abortion. Uh, some states' courts, when it comes to state law specifically, some states' courts may be more resistant to overturning state legal precedent than other states' courts might be. And that's, as far as I know, there's not really a comprehensive study into that kind of thing. Is how has this state overturned precedent in its court rulings before compared to this state? As far as I know, there's nothing like that. But it would be a very interesting report to see if it ever did come to fruition. And then each state just has different political and legal considerations when it comes to their court systems. Number one, we see various selection methods for state level judges. Some of them are appointed by the governor. Some of them are appointed by the governor, but from a list of candidates from a judicial nominating commission. They might be nonpartisan elections. They might be partisan elections. The legislature might choose them. So all these different considerations for how these judges are selected and where different kinds of pressure could come from, whether it's coming from voters or from the governor or from the state legislature, and then different levels of home rule already afforded to states. So a state that already has more home rule would probably be a little bit more amenable to further home rule in the future, or they might not. It depends on the situation, because we still have seen even in more home rule oriented states where state law, or there's been more state preemption of local law. Challenge number 3 is the perception of subservience of local to state governments. While there is some similarity to the relationship between federal and state governments, it's not a one-to-one comparison. There is that concept of federalism between federal and state governments, where federal has some jurisdiction that belongs specifically to federal government. State governments have jurisdiction that belongs to them specifically, and then there's some cases where federal and state share jurisdiction. Local governments versus state governments don't really quite have that, at least not to the same degree. And then also because the U.S. Constitution mostly left it up to the states to figure out how to handle local government, because even though it has some provision for how federal and state governments should interact with each other, you don't really see, it's basically silent. The U.S. Constitution is basically silent on local governments. So local governments, even in more home rule oriented states, are treated as subdivisions of the state. State governments aren't really treated as subdivisions of federal government. Now, maybe that's a fair perception of local governments being creatures of the state government. Maybe it's not. Whatever the case may be, whatever your opinion is on that, that is the traditional view, is to see local governments as merely subdivisions of the state and therefore subservient to the state. It's not really, again, not really the case for federal versus state governments. And then ultimately, state law, regardless of home rule, trumps local law based on level of supremacy. So it's sometimes hard for local governments to push back. Fourth major challenge for home rule is the difficulty in amending state constitutions and differences in citizens' ability to directly impact state laws. So if you want stronger, longer lasting home rule provisions, you're going to need to amend state constitutions, not just state statutes. And statutes are much easier for the state legislature to change. So even if you got some sort of home rule provision in the state statutes and state codes, which are basically the same thing as statutes, just compiled a little differently, state legislatures later on can more easily change that. If you have it in the state constitution, it's not so easy to change. And states have various methods through which to amend their state constitutions. Some of them have a bunch of different methods. Some of them only have one or two. In some cases, citizens can get directly involved. You see a lot of times citizen-initiated ballot measures to change the state constitution. And there are some states that also let them have some say in changing state statutes. So sometimes you'll see these things come up to a vote by the public. However, some states have a tougher path toward passing amendments than others. For example, some states have a single subject rule for ballot initiatives, which means that your ballot measure has to address one subject. Now, what exactly it means to be one subject, that depends on state, and that depends on arguments made by plaintiffs and defendants in the case. Could state governments use this rule against home rule advocacy to say that home rule is encompassing more than one subject? I don't know. Maybe they can. It depends on how effective they are in arguing that and how receptive judges are to that argument. But home rule advocates might be able to also successfully say this is specifically about home rule, so it is just one subject. Not every state has that requirement for ballot initiatives, though. There's different requirements for signatures, so you don't just get a ballot measure on the ballot just because you want it to. You have to have a certain percentage of the electorate sign petitions that say, I want this ballot measure on the ballot. What that threshold is, the percentage of signatures needed, it depends on the state and where exactly you have to get signatures, because some states might require not only do you need to get a specific percentage of the electorate, you might need to get a certain amount from each congressional district, not just anywhere in the state. And usually a state, or there's also then when it gets on the ballot, there's different thresholds for actually passing constitutional amendments. Usually you'll see a state require just 50% of voter approval to pass, or 50% plus one. But at least one state requires 55% of the vote, and I can't remember which state that is. I want to say it was like Arkansas or something, but I can't remember for sure. And then Florida requires 60%. And then you see some states trying to pass or have passed legislation making it more difficult to collect signatures for ballot measures and get them to the ballot for a vote. Ballotpedia says that from 2018 to 2024, 57 bills or resolutions passed in the 26 states with a statewide initiative or referendum process. Most commonly, we saw it in South Dakota, where there was 11 such bills or resolutions, Arizona with 7, Florida with 6, and then Arkansas and Utah with 5. So to actually get it into the state constitution, these home rule, a home rule amendment, it's a pretty steep climb, steeper in some states versus others. Number 5 challenge for home rule is the low placement of home rule on overall political agendas. So not everything that is an issue that is brought up in a state legislative session or in Congress for that matter. Not everything in a government that is on the political agenda will actually make it to make it further, other than this is a thing that's been proposed, might not even make it out of the committee stage in a state legislature. Other things might become more pressing, and the leadership of a legislature will determine or has the most say in determining which things are heard first, which things are considered more important. And home rule typically doesn't have quite the prominence that a lot of other issues have. So abortion, whether to expand it or restrict it, guns, whether to loosen gun control or to tighten gun control, various educational issues. Those kinds of things are going to get a lot more publicity and attention by the legislature than home rule is usually. So some states also have much shorter sessions than other states. Some states, there's a few states that are year round, but other states might only have like 2 or 3 or 4 months or 5 months. So because they have shorter legislative sessions, it might be more difficult for home rule to get on their agendas versus a state where the legislature meets year-round. So that's another issue for home rule. Number 6, we talked about it earlier, the increase in state preemptions of local government ordinances on things like immigration and COVID, when COVID had first hit. Early in the episode, we mentioned it's become increasingly common to preempt local government. Just to recap, though, various state legislative bills are being passed and or discussed that include preemption clauses, which say this law preempts local regulations or something to that effect. And immigration is probably the biggest flashpoint currently. And because state law has supremacy over local law, it can be difficult for local governments to try to stop state preemption because of the threat of removal of local officials for things like malfeasance, misfeasance, nonfeasance. So there's only so much that local governments can do to try to defy state government. Number 7, what is the appropriate level of home rule? So last episode, we talked about how the National League of Cities had 4 categories where states may allow discretionary authority for local governments to implement their own laws. 1 is structural, so that's things like how to form a government and chartering and enacting charter revisions for municipalities. Local charters, more or less, are constitutions, but for that municipality or counties. Well, I don't think counties have a charter, but cities and towns that have charters, not necessarily that they will have more home rule, but they generally do. And you might see particularly large cities have these charters. So that's structural. Number 2 category that local governments might have discretionary authority in is the functional. So whether they can generally exercise local self-government in a broad or limited manner. Number 3, fiscal. How do they determine revenue sources? How do they set tax rates? How do they borrow funds? Things like that. And then number 4, which is personnel. So setting employment rules for local government, employment conditions, collective bargaining agreements. Because it's such a complex topic, home rule, there's a lot of room for people to disagree on policy and what should be encompassed by home rule. And that's even the case for people who are generally supportive of home rule. So maybe somebody is a lot more supportive of home rule in terms of how these local governments should be able to structure themselves, but they might be a little bit more hesitant to support home rule in fiscal considerations. So how these local governments can set tax rates. Maybe somebody who's generally supportive of home rule is not so supportive of them having more latitude in fiscal matters. And while they might agree they might agree on the fact that state governments have gone too far in preempting local government, they might not agree on where exactly that line is. So do they agree that states are going too far in preempting local government on immigration? What about with regards to COVID or abortions or guns? Depending on the issue, people might see where that line is drawn, might not exactly agree on that, even if they generally agree that there should be more home rule implemented. So that's challenge number 7. And then the 8th challenge we're going to cover is that states with low levels of party competition in state politics and high levels of party uniformity, it's going to make it much tougher for home rule to be implemented. So arguably, more states are trending towards one-party dominance in their state governments. There's a lot of them that are trending more towards Republican. There's a lot of them that are trending more towards Democrat. And when one party runs the show, there is less recourse for the minority party to push back, especially at the local level. And as a result, the state governments can feel empowered to tell local governments more and more what they have to do, as there is less chance of defeating those state elected officials in elections. And there's also that tendency, and this is anybody can fall into this trap because we're human beings, is the tendency toward groupthink. Basically, because the group thinks one thing, you change your opinion to align with the group. And that can affect anybody regardless of political views. And low-ranking members of the dominant party may be convinced to fall in line with the rest of the party on issues, even if they might normally have a different opinion. And you see groupthink all the time in politics, especially in a national context. It's more and more common for Republicans to agree with each other on things, and more common for Democrats to agree with each other on things. So when you have that one track mind, which again, anybody can fall for, in the state level, they're generally going to probably try to tell local governments more and more what they can and cannot do. Now, again, I'm not trying to say that there needs to be more home rule or there shouldn't be more home rule, but that is something to really consider, because when you have low levels of party competition, it's really not good for governance in general, because there is no room for dissent and you can't really have discussions on anything. Competition in elections is healthy for political systems. Now, I don't want to make it sound like it's all doom and gloom for home rule advocates, because there are opportunities for home rule advocates to get done what they want to get done. As more or less as the saying goes, there's opportunity within adversity. One of the big opportunities that home rule advocates have is the Ninth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which basically says any rights not specified in the U.S. Constitution belong to the people. Now, this is usually considered more for members of the public, not for local governments. But could this be successfully applied to local governments? Because given their proximity to regular people and how much local governments affect locals directly, they could possibly say that, hey, these state encroachments on local government, on home rule, are infringing upon people's rights that are not enumerated in the Constitution, which are protected by the Ninth Amendment. But that could also run up against the 10th Amendment, which is that powers not in the U.S. Constitution belong to state governments. So there might be a little bit of tug and pull there. Maybe there's other constitutional provisions like 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause that you could possibly argue, depending on, well, how well your legal team is able to argue for those things. It might not be so easy to make those cases for local government, but maybe there will be in the future. There's also opportunity with the general frustrations boiling over with state governments. Obviously, anger is fomenting against government officials in general, and unfortunately, it sometimes spills over to violence. But state preemption may eventually spur further grassroots action for home rule. And that grassroots action has happened in the past when home rule provisions were enacted in various states in the late 19th and early 20th century. Most major political trends in the nation have started off local, and home rule would be the same case, and would be aptly so. After all, home rule is maybe the most local of local government issues that there is. So, of course, it would have to start local. Of course, it would have to start at the grassroots level. As the former Speaker of the U.S. House, Tip O'Neill, said that all politics is local, and that is still mostly true today. So, home rule is going to have to start somewhere, and it's going to have to start at the very, very bottom, at the grassroots level. And then there's also opportunity in state ballot measures and conventions. We talked about how some states make it more difficult for ballot measures to get on the ballot for a vote and subsequently to get passed. So some states make that easier, some states make that harder, but you do have that opportunity. That's why the National League of Cities has that home rule amendment proposal, that basis for a state to implement a home rule proposal with their own tweaks specific to that state. And there's also the possibility of state constitutional conventions, which provide opportunity for more wholesale change to a state constitution. It's how most, if not all, states have had multiple state constitutions throughout the years, because the U.S. Constitution, it's been amended 27 times, but it's been the same document for over 230 years. A lot of states, however, have had multiple state constitutions. And in fact, Ballotpedia says as of 2023, there have been 233 constitutional conventions to deliberate state constitutions. And sometimes those have resulted in more or less completely new state constitutions. Maybe not completely new, but largely new state constitutions. 42 states have rules that govern how a constitutional convention can be called, but 14 states have a constitutional convention question as an automatic ballot referral. So it does not have to be, you don't have to gather petitions to put the ballot measure on the ballot to say, hey, we need to call a constitutional convention. Do you agree? State legislatures don't need to put forth a question about a constitutional convention. It's an automatic ballot referral, so it just happens automatically. And that happens in 16 different states. So 5 states have 10-year intervals between this constitutional convention question. Michigan has 16-year intervals, and then 8 states have 20-year intervals. Now, even if they have a constitutional convention, does not necessarily mean that it's going to be a wholesale change to said constitution, but you could see much larger changes to those state constitutions. And with those large changes might be a change to home rule, because that would be a pretty significant change for these state constitutions, especially in states where they follow Dillon's rule more than they do home rule. And then the last opportunity we'll cover is that since some states have an easier time, or at least theoretically would have an easier time implementing home rule in state law, maybe that'll lead to national momentum. Now, again, different political realities in each state with sometimes similar, sometimes unique circumstances. And we sometimes too often make the assumption that one state doing something will spur other states to do the same. But it could happen in this case. And we've seen that happen with various different issues where a couple of states were uh, doing something and then other states started to pick it up. Maybe home rule will do that. And in fact, in the past, home rule was picking up steam after that Cooley rule was made, which said that local governments have some inherent rights to self-governance. So if grassroots action is effective enough, you might see home rule eventually become a national issue. So we covered the challenges and opportunities for home rule. Now let's get into why you should care about this. Because it's all well and good to know all this stuff, and it's interesting stuff. At least I think it's very interesting stuff. But you also have to teach people or tell people why they should care. So, why should you care about home rule versus Dillon's rule? And again, not making an argument for home rule or for Dillon's rule. It's just that this is very important to consider. One reason it's important to consider is because local government has the most direct impact on your daily life. They handle public works and utilities. Local courts, which you run into much more often and generally first before higher level courts, they maintain retirement and pension systems, administer and fund elections. Election administration is the vast majority of it is handled by local governments, provide certain recreational and educational services. They handle local parks, give local permits for various activities and functions, like for new businesses or for building certain structures on your property or local festivals, so on and so on. So many things that local government has an impact on. And obviously, state and federal government matter too, but local government has a lot more of that impact on your day-to-day life. So, as such, you should know what they are doing just as much as your state and federal governments do. Now, whether they should take the lead on more government policies apart from the state government, I mean, that's up for you to decide. The debate between home rule and Dillon's rule is also a fundamental question about the will of the people. Both state and local governments are, mostly at least, elected by the people. There's some appointed officials here and there. Is the will of the people, though, being fulfilled by state preemption and thus Dillon's rule, or is it by home rule? How much should a local government be able to dissent from the rest of a state? How much direct impact should the people have in general? So, and that those can become their whole other debates that don't even necessarily have to do with home rule, but just some of those questions to really think about, to really get the gears going in your mind when you think about why this is such an important issue. And then also has great importance regarding the efficiency and responsiveness of government. When is it more effective for the state government to address an issue? And when is that the case for local government? For example, when we were talking about the debate between state home rule and Dillon's rule on the last episode, one of the arguments was about which one is better for addressing corruption, because if when you invest too much power in any person or entity, they're going to eventually step over the line. But where is that line between, or when it comes to state and local relations? You have too much state power, local governments can't respond to their issues. Too much local power, and they can just defy state government policies when they want. When it comes to corruption, back in the really early days of this debate, home rule advocates argued that state government had been really corrupt in how they picked winners and losers in local government, and the local governments needed to be able to address their own issues, and the people need to be able to address local state government corruption more directly. But then Dillon's rule advocates argued that the state government was needed so that local governments didn't step out of line too much. So a bit of a back and forth in that regard. But in any case, regardless of your views on the issue, when power is abused, that inherently leads to less efficient and less responsive government. And when it's a single person or a single entity that has too much power, or even just a small handful of people or small handful of groups, you can guarantee that at some point they're going to abuse that power. It's human nature. It can happen to anybody. So whether home rule or Dillon's rule is best for addressing that, I mean, that's up to you to decide, but we really do need to think about it when it comes to how efficient and responsive government is. So that's going to do it for today's episode. As always, thank you so much for listening and watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and share the podcast with all the people you know, with your networks. Various links in the show notes, and that National League of Cities report I'll include in the show notes for this episode as well. But other things in my show notes: Facebook, LinkedIn, my book on Amazon, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Could Become More Competitive, my educational email course, short educational email course on some of the ways we unintentionally enhance polarization, why we make those mistakes, and how we could actually fix those mistakes, and a couple of other things as well. But thank you again so much for listening, and check all that stuff out. And please also rate the podcast on wherever you get the podcast, I guess YouTube doesn't necessarily have a rating system, but Spotify and Apple Podcasts, preferably a good review, please. But I'm going to go ahead and sign off and stop rambling. So, as always, thank you so much for listening and watching. And until next time, take care.